Hans Wilsdorf. Hans Wilsdorf. Wilsdorf. Hey, what is up, Watch fam? My name is Michael. I am from Theo and Harris. Usually I'm the editor, but now they let me make videos. Anyways, we are on Rolex History Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1, definitely check it out down below. And this video is going to be more about how Rolex got their watches to be featured in a bunch of major world feats, which really got Rolex on the map. So basically, I'm going to briefly touch on a bunch of achievements by society that Rolex was involved in. But before we do that, I have many things to address. First off, I'm wearing a Rolex 1601 with a Jubilee bracelet. Absolutely beautiful. Beautiful watch, keeps great time, and it is from 1970. So the year I was born minus 25. Okay, now before we hop into Rolex history, I did tell you that I made a part 1. There are a few things from that video that I want to address real quick. First things first, I was saying Wilsdorf the whole time. It's Wilsdorf. I don't know why I just didn't see the S, and even then, I'm not pronouncing it very well, but it's Wilsdorf. W-I-L-S-D-O-R-F. I think I spelled that right. But there's a point in the video where I say Wilsdorf like 12 times in a row, and if you know I'm saying it wrong, it's gone. Anyways, two more things. So I said Rolex made the first automatic winding movement, and a few users actually called me out and said that's not technically correct. One of them being the Spook. I'm sorry, I can't read your username. One of them being the Spook actually said John Harwood with Fortis AD did the first automatic winding watch before Rolex. This was confirmed by Rolex in 1956 with an apology to Harwood. The history of that brand is very interesting. Also, I think a user named Ucky or something like that said the same thing. Basically, my reason for saying this is Rolex created the first complete automatic movement. Yes, these watches were automatic, meaning that you could wear them on your wrist and you didn't have to wind them, but they were bumper movements. So instead of a rotor being inside the watch going 360 degrees continuous, these watches had, I believe, a 200-degree cap. So they would basically hit a spring and bounce back up at 200 degrees. So I separate bumper and automatic movements all the time. I used to flip watches and people would always freak out when I say Omega's first automatic movement was, I think, in the 60s or 70s or something, because technically they had bumper movements before that. So yes, Rolex did not have the first automatic winding watch. There were others, but they did have the first perpetual rotor. Also, a few people mentioned the fact that I said Rolex had the first GMT movement, and they said, what about the Gleitze Airman? I think that was 1953, before Rolex came out with their GMT. And the thing I was thinking there was that the Gleitze Airman, released in 1953, had a 24-hour dial, unlike regular watches or normal watches that we see that have a 12-hour dial, and then you would change the bezel for your GMT time. Although I'm not sure if it's GMT time or just you would change the bezel to get the GMT. Now, the reason I said that Rolex had the first GMT movement is because I was under the impression that Gleitze had a 24-hour movement and they had the outer bezel in order to get GMT time. Well, on the other hand, Rolex had a 12-hour dial, the outer bezel, and a dependent hand that actually moved and changed, which made me say that Rolex had the first GMT movement and not 24-hour movement. But I could be getting those lines crossed, and as always, if I say something that you think is wrong or seems wrong in the video, I'll either try to explain my thinking in the comments in the next video, or I'll just say that I was wrong. Could go either way, you never know. And last but not least, I actually have the flu, so if some of my face looks weird, that's why. So we left off the last video basically saying that Rolex recognized the world needed a precise and reliable timepiece to go on their wrist, and they did exactly that. And that's why Rolex became what they are, because they were the first to be like, you need a reliable watch? Here is a definitely reliable watch. I just want to say something crazy about these vintage Rolexes and the people that actually worked with them. Here's my thing. I've had many dive watches. I haven't had crazy expensive dive watches like a Rolex Submariner, but I've had Christopher Wards, I've had SKXs, Orients. These are all cheap watches, but they're cheap dive watch tool watches, and they're great. I can go swimming with them, and I love testing the limits of watches. I wore my Sarb 033 swimming all the time. I tried to see how deep I can get with it. I would throw it at the bottom of pools. For some reason, I love just torturing watches. This Rolex, this 1970 Rolex, I won't. But the fact that even with modern day wristwatches, which are built so much better than early Rolexes just because technology is always evolving, the fact that these people did such crazy things with them in that time, and now I'm scared to go swimming with my SKX dive watch, blows my mind. When I read this stuff, I'm like, you did what? In a bubble back? That's a good investment. You should put that in your safe. You shouldn't be flying across Mount Everest with that, but not going swimming with a Rolex Submariner. I think of that now and I'm just like, that's bonkers. Rolex was touting the fact that they had a waterproof watch in the 20s. And in 1927, Mercedes Gleitze, I'm not quite sure how to say her name, I apologize. She swam across the English, well, almost swam across the English Channel with a Rolex strapped around her neck. And basically what happened was that she swam the English Channel successfully on October 7th, 1927. And then someone basically said, I did it faster. And she was like, well, no, you didn't. So 14 days later, Mercedes Gleitze is going to do the Vindication swim and swim across the English Channel again. Although it was much colder this time, it was freezing. And Hans Wilsdorf basically said, hey Mercedes, do you like this watch? And she said, yes, I do. And he said, well, you can have it under the condition that when you swim across the English Channel, you are wearing this watch. And she did exactly that. Although she didn't make it the second time because it was so much colder, she got pulled out of the water on the brink of losing consciousness. And basically what Rolex says and a few other sources say is that a reporter at the time was writing about the event and noticed a small gold watch around her neck that although she just swam across the English Channel and almost herself lost consciousness, the watch was still ticking and keeping great time. So Hans Wilsdorf, being the great marketer that he is, buys a full-page spread basically saying, look what happened and look who was wearing our watch. This is a worldwide human accomplishment that basically, one, a woman swam across the English Channel, then 14 days later almost did it again. This is huge. Mercedes, I'm sorry I can't really say her last name that well, Gleitze was everywhere. She was in superstardom mode, which is something that we really don't have now, but we'll go into that a little bit later about Rolex capturing a time period. But she was everywhere, and everywhere that there was a picture of her, there was a small gold watch around her neck, and it lit like wildfire. And even though Rolex was already known as a great brand, this is a huge marketing push. And this is something else I saw that I just thought was really interesting. The Vienna Herald described the 1969 Apollo moon landing as an event almost as significant as the time a woman swam most of the English Channel with a waterproof watch on. That's cool. Anyways, fast forward to 1931 and here comes an automatic Rolex. And now, I forget where I read this, but I really like this fact. I said it on a different video, but basically it said that Rolex had waterproof cases, but the watches were still hand wound, so people would basically unscrew the crown and then go swimming, forget to screw it back in and be like, yo, what the heck, my watch broke. And to alleviate that issue, Rolex released their reference 520 movement, their first automatic movement with a fully perpetual rotor, and that is where we have the bubble back. I really love bubble backs. Alright, so it's pretty common knowledge that in 1953 a Rolex summited Mount Everest. We'll go into that in a little bit. But 20 years before that, in 1933, there was actually the first flyover of Mount Everest. And cool enough, there was a Rolex there. This is actually one of my favorite stories, so I'm not going to get too in depth, but if you want to look into a story, this is a really cool one. So in April 1933, Douglas Hamilton and Colonel Stewart Blackard flew a modified Westland PV-3 biplane over Mount Everest. But following behind them in a Westland PV-6 was Flight Lieutenant David McIntyre and photographer S.R. Bonnet. So this is actually why I really like this story, because it's super heavily photographed, so you can look up basically everything about this flight. What's crazy about that is this is just people in biplanes. There's nothing enclosed around them. They are just out. They are just up in the air in a plane flying over Mount Everest. And I see biplanes fly over me now like every once in a while, and I'm like, wow, I would never go in those. Those are so unsafe. Can you imagine going over Mount Everest in one of those? That is insane. So there was nothing around them. They were basically just in their warm gear, and they had oxygen tanks so that they could breathe at such an altitude. And when I was reading about it, I actually saw this little blurb here, and I thought it was just insane. At one point in the flight, Bonnet felt faint and experienced shooting pains in his stomach. He paused filming and sat down inside the cabin, where he discovered a gaping fracture in his oxygen line. He quickly tied a handkerchief around the breach and was able to resume his duties without losing consciousness. Okay, so pause. These are all huge human achievements, and where there was a huge human achievement, Rolex was pretty much there, except the moon. Don't talk about the moon. If you go to Rolex headquarters, very sore subject. Okay, and here's a very important quote from that flight that I want to talk about at the end of this video. It is a splendid achievement, not for any material gains, any additions to aeronautical knowledge that it brings, for it brings few or none, but simply because it was one of the few last great spectacular flights in aviation which remain to be done. So put a pin in that quote and we're gonna hit it at the end of the video. So Rolex was basically at all of the great events that were happening in the 20s and the 30s, all these huge events. Sir Malcolm Campbell broke the land speed record at 300 miles an hour, and of course he was wearing a Rolex strapped to his wrist, and he said it performed beautifully. All these people, it's like the 1930s writing, they're like, and the Rolex performed wonderfully. But Rolex was there for everything. So if we fast forward to World War II, Rolex has a great reputation. So great, in fact, that Royal Air Force pilots were actually buying Rolexes to replace their standard issue watches. However, the problem was that when these pilots were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps, their watches got confiscated. When Hans Wilsdorf heard this, he offered to replace all of their watches for free until the end of the war. So payment wasn't due until the end of the war. Soldiers would explain their circumstances, how they don't have the watch and where they were located, and Hans Wilsdorf himself ran this entire thing and would send them out himself. I don't mean he went to the post office, but he was the one sending the watches out or giving them the green light. Anyways, and now here's a cool, more specific story. On March 10th, 1943, while still a prisoner of war, Corporal Clive James Nutting, one of the organizers of the Great Escape, ordered a stainless steel Rolex Oyster 3525 chronograph by mail directly from Hans Wilsdorf. Wilsdorf is reported to have been impressed with Nutting because, although not an officer, he had ordered the expensive Rolex 3525 Oyster chronograph, while most other prisoners ordered the much cheaper Rolex Speed King model, which was popular because of its small size. That is, people now, they just want to wear tires on their wrist. People want tires. People in World War II, they wanted small watches, like toy car tires. Good analogy, Mike. The watch is believed to have been ordered specifically to be used in the Great Escape. As a chronograph, it could have been used to time patrols of prison guards or time the 76 ill-fated escapees through Tunnel Harry on the 24th of March, 1944. That is insane, and by definition, the most tool a tool watch can be. Getting a chronograph because you're a prisoner of war and you need it to time guard patrols to escape is insane. I use the timer feature on my G-Shock to cook noodles to make them al dente, and even then they're not. They're just like, it's like I'm eating erasers. Anyways, so remember that quote I talked about before where it was saying there's not really a lot of stuff that humanity hasn't done yet, which is really something unbelievable to think about. At the time period of these great, like, crazy achievements is kind of behind us in a weird way. I mean, obviously we haven't been to Mars and stuff like that. The fact that there was the first woman to swim across the English Channel, feats like that are kind of gone. I don't want to say gone as in they'll never happen again, because there may be something that I'm not even thinking of, but the time period of people just doing crazy things like that and flying biplanes over Everest and stuff like that are a very, very special time in humanity that we love. We make movies about all of these events. We love these events. And there are a few more that I'm gonna get into in part 3 of this video. I'm stopping it right before we get to the date just because that is a specialty of Theo and Harris. Anyways, by Rolex being there at all of these huge human achievements, people swimming across the channel, people breaking sound barriers, people flying across Mount Everest, people climbing Mount Everest, so on and so forth. They are essentially what we still have from that time period. We still have Rolex. It's not like Mercedes Gleitze was wearing a Speedo. It's not like Sir Malcolm Campbell was driving a Chevy. It's not anything like that, you know? They didn't go over Mount Everest in a Boeing, but they did fly over Mount Everest wearing a Rolex. They did break the land speed record wearing a Rolex. They swam across the English Channel wearing a Rolex. There's so many things where Rolex was there, and that's the only thing that still exists and is still a powerhouse from that time period that was widely publicized, that just stayed. It just stayed with us. And that's a big reason as to why I love Rolex. I know a lot of people say it's bland and stuff, and I agree. I think the new models are pretty bland. A Rolex is a Rolex basically now. Because back then it wasn't just, oh sick, that's a nice Rolex. It was, oh my god, I just saw an advertisement that watch swam across the English Channel. It was fine. You have one of those? How is it? And it's obviously not just Rolex that has accomplishments like that. I mean, Omega went to the moon. The Speedmaster saved lives when they had to time something, I think docking. They had to time docking or something, and they could only do it with the wristwatch because their system went down or something like that. But it just has so much more magic than being like, oh, I bought this $8,000 sub and I'm scared to go swimming with it. It's something very different. That's why I love the history of Rolex. Stay tuned for part 3, the finale. I actually don't know how we'll make it a finale. Maybe I'll bring champagne. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate all the love that you guys are giving me. If you like this video, toss it a thumbs up. If you don't, toss it a thumbs down. If you want to subscribe to Theo and Harris, you definitely should. It'll make me look good. But I will see you guys soon on In the Metal. Have a good rest of your whatever time period you are in right now. Have a good 1920s.